Welcome everyone who has just come into the Zoom room. We are happy for you to have joined us this afternoon. We are going to give a few minutes, grace period for people to join us. We have had some really very nice attendance for these classes, and we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity. We know people are on other cities and just finishing a class or finishing saying some of the keynote. So we're just giving a couple of extra moments and then we will begin. Thanks for your patience. Once again, for those that are just coming into the Zoom room, thank you for being on with us this afternoon. We are just giving a couple of additional moments for people to join us, and then we will begin the afternoon shiur. Good afternoon, everyone. On this Tisha B'Av, we want to thank you for joining us for the second in the series of this afternoon's classes. We are, as we do each of our Zooms, beginning our Zoom by continuing to wish a refuah shlema to all those who are ill during this difficult time period, and giving our continued support and condolence to those who have lost loved ones. And we also want to give our thanks to all those on the front lines who continue to do God's work for the greater community and for our community. We are very privileged today to have the leader of our high school, Rabbi Shlomo Stochel, who will be delivering a class on rabbinic leadership, moral or political, the role of the sages in the destruction of Yerushalayim. Rabbi Stochel, whenever he does give us the opportunity to hear his words, really enhances the commemoration, celebration of every event that he's part of. We thank him for all that he does for our students, for his leadership with our faculty and staff, and for what he does for the school community at large. Today's class is sponsored by Leslie and Charles Ackerman, class of 64. They are a class of 64 couple, in memory of Nathan Berliner, and by Lauren and Ronnie Simhon in memory of Jeffrey Rosenbaum, and by Zohara and Taragin in memory of Yosef, Chaim, Leib, ben Dovid. May all of those neshamot have an aliyah, and may this shiur and this class give an enhancement to all of us as we commemorate the destruction of the temple. Thank you all for being on with us today. Rabbi Stochel, thank you very much for giving us your scholarship and your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. I know we cannot greet each other, so I would not say welcome. On Tisha B'Av, I do want to give credit for credit is due, because Mr. Ackerman just said something about my scholarship. This is certainly not my scholarship, but I do want to give credit so I don't forget. Much of what I will be teaching and learning with you comes from a fantastic book by Jeffrey Rubenstein, who is a professor of Judaic studies and especially of Talmudic studies. He published several books, and the one that is my favorite is called Talmudic Stories. And it's a source critical, historically critical, as well as thematic development of many of the Agadot in Shas. As some of my students know, I've got a particular affinity for the Agadic sections in Shas. So we're going to learn together very famous stories that are probably familiar to you from past learning and past Tisha B'Av commemorations. I also want to warn you a little bit that the title of the talk was meant to be provocative, because I think that you might be surprised by something that we don't all take for granted, which is we sometimes have this sort of elevated sense of the way in which Chazal, the rabbis, saw themselves. But it's pretty clear from modern scholarship that the rabbis were very, very willing to mock themselves, to be self-critical, and to point out some of the weaknesses, and sometimes do it in rather subtle ways, sometimes very blatant ways. And that's part of the question here. There are so many questions that arise from the story, because if we look at the language and look at the themes and try to figure out what the thematic message is here in terms of destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, we might be surprised that there isn't a definitive answer, even if some of the statements seem to be very confident, but that there's a lot of hedging. There's a lot of mocking, there's a lot of self-mocking, and there are a lot of issues that come up about the relationship between the rabbis and the aristocracy, between the rabbis and the military, between the rabbis and the relationship to halakha. It is fascinating, it is very nuanced, and we've got to start going because we could be doing this for hours. It actually is a very long section. I'm going to try to run through it reading the Aramaic, but in the sources I also have a interspersed translation into English, so you're of course welcome to follow that. I have bolded the words that I think are significant and thematic using Jeffrey Rubenstein's scholarship. I'd love to be able to let you interject and to ask questions, because that's what teaching and learning is all about. But we do want to get through as much of the Agadah as possible. Please use the chat. Is it available to everyone? Please use the chat to any questions, and I'll try my best to sort of, finesse it into the presentation and let us go. So I'm going to share, my screen with heavy reliance on Sapphire's translation that I've edited a little bit just to sort of conform to the presentation. Okay. Without any other introductions, just be aware there's going to be sort of provocative messages here. There's going to be a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of literary references as well as the story itself. Also, just to know, for those of you who have a more critical perspective on Talmudic analysis, it's very clear that there are many stories that are interwoven here. These stories appear in other places by themselves, but there is an overseeing narrator. There's a very clear storyteller voice here, and we are going to sort of focus on the storyteller's voice and the language that's used, even to connect disparate stories that appear in other places, but are clearly put together, redacted for very, very clear purposes with all the nuance and complexity. So we begin famously with Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Right away, cautionary phrase, a caution on that word. This is Rabbi Yochanan the Amora, meaning lived during the period of the Talmud. It is not the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who will then become inserted in a very critical way in the story later. This is an Amora reflecting upon events that happened well before. My dichtiv, what is it that says? And this seems to be the central focusing pasuk, even though it's never quoted again. Ashrei adam mefached tamid u'maksheh libo yipol ra'ah. Happy is the man who is forever fearful or cautious. U'maksheh libo yipol bera'ah. But one who hardens his heart will fall into disaster or misfortune. Please keep in mind this pasuk, because there are different ways of looking at a binary statement here. It could be happy is one, sad will be the other, but it's probably easier to translate this as happy is the one who is always fearful, but if that fear devolves into something else, a hard-heartedness, then disaster will occur. So keep in mind that alternative interpretation. Akamtza bar kamtza chav Yerushalayim, regarding or because of the story, the anecdote of Kamta bar Kamta, Yerushalayim was destroyed. And that is the famous reference. We'll talk about the name Kamta in a few moments, but let's get into the narrative itself. So in the narrative itself, Akamta Kamta chav Yerushalayim, you can tell that the first statement is what we call sort of a prolepsis, which means it's an amora many years later reflecting back upon it and quoting a pasuk in connection to it. And now we actually get to the story as it happened. Kamta kaba kamta chav Yerushalayim, so it's a repeat of the same phrase. Del gavra derachme kamta va devava bar kamta avet sudata Amar le l'shamei zil aitili kamta azal aitili bar kamta. Famous mistaken identity in which there were two men by the name of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, which again is a little bit of a kind of a comical sort of spin on these symbolic names, the meaning of which we'll address in a moment. Almost reminds you of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Their names are very similar. It's almost like there's Kamsa and the son of Kamsa, even though there's no relationship between the two, we understand from the story. One is a sworn enemy of Ahu Gavra, meaning we have an anonymous host who holds a banquet, Sudata, sends his servant, important word Shameh that will reappear, Zil Aitili also reappears throughout the story, go bring me Kamsa, but the Shameh, the servant, makes a mistake and instead brings Bar Kamsa. Mistaken identity, relatively innocent until he appears at the banquet. Ate Ashechei Dahaveyativ, the host, again, we know the name of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, if whether they're their real names or not may not matter. We do not know the name of the host. Whenever that's done, it is probably from a literary perspective meant to keep you seeing that person as sort of anonymous and representing possibly a caste or a group. Amalei, Michte, Tahu Gavra, Dabava Tahu Gavrahu. That man is the enemy of that man. He's just also speaking of himself in the third person. That man is my enemy, my baitacha. What are you doing here? Kumpo, get up and leave. Amrale, so Bar Kamsa says to him, Hol v'atai, since I'm already here, Shavkan, let me stay. Very important phrase too, we'll see repeated, Shavkan, let me stay. I will pay for whatever I eat and drink. So he pleads with the anonymous host that he should stay. And also emphasis on achina v'shatina, eating and drinking. And of course, this is a banquet. And we do not know the name of the anonymous host. Amrale lo, he says, no, you can't stay. I'll pay for half of your banquet. I'll pay for everything. He takes him by the hand, stands him up, and took him out, which is fascinating because he's got lots of servants. We already know he sent one who mistakenly invited the wrong person, yet he himself is so consumed by this hatred and by his, shall we say, hard-heartedness, that he takes him physically and throws him out. Now, Amar, this is now a footnote to the story. That's the narrative, and now the response. Amar, Bar Kamsa says, presumably to himself, since the rabbis were sitting there and did not protest, Shmamina kanichalahu. For those of you who enjoy learning the halachic parts of Talmud, you would be interested in sort of seeing this. Shema Minah is a very, very clear phrase, which is always a halachic conclusion. So in a sense, it's putting halachic language in the mouth of this Bar Kamsa fellow. And also, Yat ve'Rabbanan v'lo michubei. The rabbis sat there and they did not protest. The word michubei is used a lot. Rabbis are always sitting at banquets. They're always observing society around them. And they're the moral leaders in the sense that they object to behavior that they don't like or decide some things are acceptable. It's a very common phrase within halachic agadah and halachic narrative that the rabbis are sitting at some sort of occasion. Often they're celebrating or parties or weddings of their students and protest something. Some of you may recall even a Gemara that is part of our curriculum at Ramaz, where rabbis actually move up, get themselves out of a gathering so as not to embarrass someone. But here it is where they do not protest. Now, fascinating too, did we even know in the story the rabbis were sitting there? Not until Bar Kamsa reveals to us they were sitting there, which means the storyteller leaves them out. That's also another literary technique where you leave out a central character when you want to reveal that character at the end as an indictment of their behavior, right? So he is deriving almost like a halachist. They were there, they didn't protest. Clearly it was okay that they let me be shamed in public. I will go and I will inform upon them to the king, to the Roman authorities. Fascinating phrase. Echa behu kurza is an idiomatic expression that means to conspire, right? To inform and to conspire. But notice the word, Eichel behu kurza, I will eat with them. And kurza probably means a little bit. So what's the irony here? They did not protest when my host threw me out of the banquet. I couldn't eat. He wouldn't let me eat even if I paid for everything. I'm going to go eat a little bit with the Romans, conspire against the rabbis by starting up in the way that he's about to say. So, Azal, he went, Amarle le Caesar, he says to the Caesar, Mardu bach Yudai, the Jews have rebelled against you. Amarle mi yemar, and he says, who says so? So this is where even the Caesar says, what do you mean? Just because you tell me they're rebelling, I'm not going to seize upon that. I need to be Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid. I need to be the person who's cautious all the time. Who says they're rebelling? What's your evidence? Amarle, Shadalu Korbana Chazet Imikarvin Le. Send them a sacrifice. Let's see if they offer it. So this is Bar Kamsa's revenge, not upon the anonymous hosts, but the rabbis who were silent and the rabbis who allowed the public humiliation. Let's go back just for a moment, because I do want to clarify here that he blames the rabbis. We don't know what motivated the rabbis, because they were even absent from the story until we're told later that they were there. In the words of Bar Kamsa, they could have, as I mentioned before, the protest could have been, we are going to overrule you, anonymous host, and he has to stay, so as not to public embarrass him. Or he leaves, we leave too. So they have a dilemma. What do we do? They choose to do nothing. They do not protest verbally. They do not protest physically by leaving. They are silent. Inaction seems to be how their behavior is characterized here. Yet, ironically, when Bar Kamsa comes to inform upon them, he says they're active and they're rebelling against you, these Jews. And Caesar is not willing to accept it until he has some evidence. So that's the suggestion Bar Kamsa comes up with. Next page. Azar shate bidei egla tilta. He sends, with Bar Kamsa, the Caesar does, a 3-year-old calf, which is considered a very important offering. Also notice it's 3 years old and it's a calf. Bahade deka'ate, while it's being brought along, Bar Kamsa is bringing it, shade beibuma benusfatayim, he blemishes it in the upper lip, Damarle bedukin shebe ayin, and some say in the white of the eye, a place that Jews consider to be a blemish and non-Jews do not. This now introduces for the first time a halachic consideration, which is that one, as explicit psukim of the Torah say, cannot bring a korban with a blemish, but you should know that the context for this in other places is these are very, very minor blemishes about which there is even rabbinic disagreement about whether it constitutes a mum, meaning the storyteller says a place that we consider a mum, but the Romans do not, whereas even the rabbis themselves do debate it. Now watch what happens in a fascinating little conversation. Savar Rabbanan lekruve mishum shalom malchut. The rabbis say, you know something? We should still bring this sacrifice to the Mizbeach because of Shalom Malchut. Shalom Malchut is not an invented term. It is something that is actually quite prevalent as a phrase and halachic consideration throughout Shas. Remember, Chazal lived under Roman rule, so it's something they considered a lot. And we still have a legacy of Shalom Malchut, the peace, maintaining peace with the government, the Roman authorities or the governing authorities is very critical. So they want to sacrifice. In other words, what are they willing to do? To override a halachic consideration and just do it to maintain the peace. Amrullah Rav Zachariah ben Avkulis, first time he's introduced here, Zachariah ben Avkulis, Yomru Balei Mumin Kravin Lagabe Mizbeach. But then people will say that you're allowed to bring a blemished animal on the altar in Yerushalayim. Savru Limiktale. So then they say, wait, we can do something even more dramatic. First they say, all right, look, debate among Chachamim, let's just do it. Shalom Malchut is a prevailing value. Then they say, let's kill him. Kill Bar Kamsa the Leleza Valema, that he shouldn't inform that we rejected the Romans' sacrifice. They'll say someone who places a blemish in an animal for sacrifice shall be killed, meaning neither of those are true. But what Rav Zachariah ben Avkulis is essentially saying is, no, we can't do that. They come up with another, no, we can't do that. Now, fascinating is, we all know when you have a debate among Rabbanan and an individual, we usually will follow the prevailing opinion. Here they seem to bend, cave in, cower before, for some reason, Rav Zachariah ben Avkulis, who is essentially just conveying a sense of, no, we can't do that because of what people will think. In other words, we're always worried about whispers, what people will think, what people will say, when, watch the next line, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that same Rabbi Yochanan has started off the declaration of Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid, says, An vitanu tel Rabbi Zachar ben Avkulis, hechrivat beitenu, sarfat hechalenu v'glitanu me'artzenu. Rabbi Yochanan, the same Amora who introduced the story, basically says it is the humility of Rabbi Zachar ben Avkulis who destroyed our mikdash, burned our sanctuary, exiled from our land, which is a very common phrase related to Chorban. Now, what you should know, first of all, is that this word anvitanut is never, ever used in a condemnatory fashion in Shas. Anvitanut, anava, is not only praiseworthy. The rabbis praise people and their colleagues, and even God for being a being of humility. It is never, ever used in the pejorative in Shas. So here you can also tell that the storyteller is trying to reverse all the ways you normally think about things. And what he basically is saying is Rav Zachariah's humility or excessive humility, or what we would say his meekness, led to an action that ended with these geopolitical consequences that exiled the Jewish people and destroyed the center of our religious life. So it's fascinating for all this language to be used, because it sounds like an indictment about the rabbis, because here it's not even like Zachariah ben Akulis is a singular opinion. The rabbis want to do what they want to do, but somehow it's not just his meekness, but it's even their meekness in not responding to him and saying, but it's a minor opinion, but it's Shalom Malchut, or prevailing considerations. It's almost making fun or mocking this whole process. Yomru, Yomru. So there's clearly a very subtle and not so subtle indictment of sort of halachic thinking, rabbinic thinking, maybe even sort of Talmudic hair splitting. But it's because the context is societal implications for the Jewish community and for Yerushalayim. So that's where anvitanut, yes, is a praiseworthy quality, but it's not here. This is not the realm of halacha. This is the realm of Jewish destiny. And there are things that have to be done. It can't be inaction. It can't be sort of halachic paralysis. It needs to be leadership, rabbinic leadership, but leadership. So the story continues, also with very clever uses of phrases. Shadar ilavayu leNiron Kesar. So the emperor sends Niron to attack the city because they are rebelling. They refuse to accept the sacrifice of the Romans. Kikate, when he arrives, Shadagira leMizrach, Ata nafal b'Yerushalayim. Lamarav Ata nafal b'Yerushalayim. La Baruch Hashemayim, Ata nafal b'Yerushalayim. Okay, so first of all, Niron, a Roman general, doesn't just take his order and execute his mission. He first wants to consult with an omen. He shoots out arrows one direction and they fall towards Yerushalayim. Another direction, they fall to Yerushalayim. All four directions, they all fall to Yerushalayim. So something supernatural is happening to say, you need to attack Yerushalayim. So he doesn't act until he's cautious and then finds out whether the sign in the heavens leads in that direction. Then he does something else quite perplexing and very familiar to us, but in a different context. Amar lei li'anuka, he says to a child, Psuk le psukeich, tell me what pasuk you learned today in your cheder, but I guess in the ancient context. This is very common. Rabbis would often stop, sometimes non-Jews too in Shas, I must admit, would stop children in the street, ask them what pasuk they were learning that day, and derive lessons from it. And the pasuk happened to be from Yechezkel, v'natati et mati be'Edom yadam Yisrael. I will take out my vengeance on Edom, understood as Rome, through my nation Israel. And if you read in the translation, the extension of the pasuk, you'll understand. Amar, Nero says, Kutsha barichu, v'yelach beite. God wants to destroy his house. U'v'yelach furi yedei be'ahu gavran. He wants to wipe away responsibility by blaming it on me. In other words, what is Nero undergoing, experiencing the dilemma? This is divinely ordained, right? But I don't have to do it. So even though it sounds like from the first omen, this is what I have to do. The second omen, which is actually not even supernatural, but from a pasuk from Tanakh, tells me I shouldn't do this. And he says, what do? I cannot tell my commander, the king, that I will not attack Yerushalayim, right? I'd be killed. I cannot sort of just sort of make peace or do something. There are no alternatives here. But he comes up with a creative solution. Arak ve'azal ve'aiger. He goes, he escapes, and he converts to Judaism. V'nafak mimeni Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir, the great sage Rabbi Meir, is ultimately a descendant of him. So what the storyteller basically is saying is the rabbis caused the destruction through a cascade of consequences from the banquet of inaction, from the possibility they're going to be perceived as rebelling against the Romans. And again, do nothing, do nothing, do nothing. Ashrei adam mefached tamid, but maksheh libo yipol lara'ah. Yet Nero doesn't just sort of go ahead, right? He thinks, deliberates, considers the possibility, and then comes up with a creative solution that saves him. And the indictment of the rabbis here is the rabbis' inaction led to the destruction of Yerushalayim, whereas Nero, who came up with the creative solution for himself, ends up being the ancestor of a great Torah sage. So their inaction led to the destruction of the society at that time, as well as the rabbis in Torah learning, which we'll see at the end. And yet Nero is the one who makes the decision, takes action, consults with psukim, which none of the rabbis did. There was no reference to psukim in all the discussions of the rabbis. Here, Nero, the goy, excuse my expression, quoting psukim, looking for omens, and decides that I'm going to escape, convert, and yet he is the one who proliferates Torah through his descendant. Then, Shadrei Lavai Aspasianus Caesar, of course, the emperor has a problem now because Nero left him. Oh, I'm sorry, one little play on words. So we are not talking about the historic veracity. We're talking about a narrator conveying messages in the story. Notice the play on words here. Nero, Meir, right? So it's not to say that there's a biological or genealogical descendancy here, but it makes sense thematically that Nero, from the word ner, will be the progenitor of Meir, who brings light. So there's also a pun. And I just remembered there's one little critical thing I forgot to tell you that's becoming very important now, but it's a good time for me to tell you. Let's go back to kamsa. Kamsa, some commentaries think means a handful, like a komets. But it is more likely that kamsa in Aramaic means locust. So in a sense, their names, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, are father locust or son locust, or locust senior or locust junior. It is also sort of a comical reference to looming destruction. And looming destruction that sometimes can take place in an instant, because locusts swarm through an area, just as they did in the Makot, and leave behind it famine, starvation, and destruction. So it's also sort of a little play that the Kamsa Bar Kamsa are setting the scene for the locust. Finally, we have the locust descending here. Not physically, but metaphorically. Shadrei ilavai liaspanus Caesar, so Aspasianus replacing Nero, who went to convert. Atat sarle tlat shane. Notice also, where did you hear the phrase tlat shane? The calf that was sent as the korban was a 3-year-old calf. Here, the Romans, Aspasianus, Vespasian, set siege to the city for 3 years. Almost like, again, that measure for measure. Midah keneged midah. You rejected our Roman sacrifice of a 3-year-old calf. We are going to now besiege the city for 3 years. Now we have a whole new faction we have never seen before introduced into the story. There are 3 wealthy people. Now these wealthy people should have some echoes of the banquet that happened at the beginning of our story. And their name, Nakdimon ben Gurion, Kalba Savua ben Sitira Keset. We're going to skip this section here. One point I want to make here as you read the translation is that their names are considered to be symbolic. All 3 names are interpreted here in this section as symbolic, which gives us a little license for all the word plays we've been engaging in. Nero, Meir, Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, even by the way, Avkulis, I did mention before. Some people think that the name Zechariah ben Avkulis is Zechariah, the son of Avtulis. That it's a tet, not a kuf. And if that's the case, it's the word batal, betel. Whatever ideas the rabbis had, he overrid and just paralyzed by inaction and decided, no, that's not the right. I canceled sort of the cancel culture in a very different ancient context. I'm going to cancel everything you suggest That was why there's a pun on his name as well. So there are puns on the names of these three, but remember, these are three wealthy people. And the next section tells us about them. One of them says, I'm going to support the people in Yerushalayim with wheat and barley. Another one says, I will feed them with wine, salt, and oil. And one of them says, I'll supply them with wood. Turns out that, a side note, the Chachamim give praise to the one who gave wood, because the wood was a great gift, because wood you use for burning. And so you need a lot of wood in order to provide the burning for the ovens, for the food. So without the wood, you wouldn't have the cooked food for the population of the besieged city. There's also a very fascinating reference to Rav Chisda gave all the keys to the storehouses to a servant except for the key for wood. There's another reference here to what? A servant, but a servant not being trusted. The irony that the anonymous host of the banquet trusted his servant, messed up, created this, again, cascade of consequences. Here, Rav Chisda does not trust the servant for the most valuable part, keeping the people alive. What happens? Havabahu hanhai biryone, yet another faction. There's a faction of the aristocracy, the affluent, who are supporting the city, where the rabbis seem to be doing nothing. And then you have these brigands, these biryone. Historians sometimes refer to them as zealots. It's probably better to explain them as thugs, because the word biryone doesn't necessarily mean zealot. Some historians later on assume that there was a political faction of zealots here, but for our purposes, they are thugs. Biryone, Amrulu Rabbanan, the rabbi said to them, so here you have now pitted against each other, these thugs and the rabbis. By the way, listen carefully. Biryone, Rabbanan, same three letters of the Shoresh, right? Do you see that? Rabbanan and Biryone, Bet, Resh, Nun. Almost as if it's a play on words that the rabbis are now sort of pitted against the Biryone. We'll see how, but there's almost like you rabbis are like the Biryone. You'll see in a moment how that comes up. So the rabbis say to the Biryone, who seem to control the city, let's make peace with them. Again, remember that word shalma? They refuse to, the rabbis consider sending the sacrifice even with the blemish because they want to maintain shlom malchut. And here the rabbis try again. Let's make peace with them. Lo shafkinhu. Remember the word shafkan? Where did the word shafkan come up before? When the guest, Bar Kamsa, wanted to stay at the banquet and he would not let him. Lo shavkan, let me stay. And he refused and says lo. So there's also another irony here that the rabbis who did not take action in protesting the expulsion of Bar Kamsa from the banquet, right, are now in a position where they want to act, but they cannot. Whereas at that time, they could have acted and stopped the sequence of events. Here the narrator is saying they now try to make peace, that they did not make peace originally at the banquet between Bar Kamsa and the host. They did not make peace with the Malchut when they could have sent the sacrifice even with that minor rabbinically disputed blemish. And here they want to make peace again, but the Biryonim stop them, almost as if their own inaction ends up, even when they try to act, they are stymied by another party, the Biryone in this case. So Amar Lahu, now the Biryone come up with an idea, which is fascinating. Let's fight against the Romans. That was what the Biryone wanted to do. They didn't want to make peace. They didn't want to cower. They wanted to fight with the Romans. Amar Lahu Rabbanan, the Rabban say, Lo mistaya milta, you won't be successful. See here, you also see that same paralysis. What? You say you want to make peace. We're not letting you. We want to make war, and you're saying, no, that won't be successful. Again, paralyzed by ideas that are ashrei adam mefached tamid, being cautious, being deliberative, but not really having the courage or convictions to actually do something. But they basically say, no, war, you shouldn't do war. And the Biryone show that they are in charge. They burn all the storehouses of food, and then there's famine. Remember, famine. Why is there famine? Well, the whole story is about a banquet, right? Bar Kamsa couldn't eat, and now through the rabbi's inaction and his consorting with the Romans, they now are faced with a famine, despite the fact that they had 21 years of supplies for food to last way beyond 3 years of a siege. So you also see that same sort of measure for measure, that same sort of indictment of the rabbis. Here you had it. You decided to eat at the banquet and not leave when Bar Kamsa was expelled. And you're also at the mercy of these three wealthy people who are providing food. But now you're the victims because of your inaction. There's famine. You're responsible now for the starvation of the people in the city. There's a little bit of a secondary story here. I feel the need to sort of show it to you, even though we could still manage with our development of themes beyond this. But I like the story, and it also sort of points out factions, the rabbis, the aristocracy, the Biryone, the inaction, the aristocracy has a certain way of doing it. So this is a representative, not the faction, but it's actually individualized by a name. So as we had an anonymous host of the banquet, here you have actually another aristocrat, a woman whose name is Marta Bat Baitus, Atirate Yerushalayim Havia. Now note again, the three people who are saving the city or thought they would save the city with their storehouses of food are also called Atire, from the word Ashir, wealthy. Shadrata Lishlucha ve'Amrle. This is a very comical story. But if you follow along in English without my going through it, she says to her shliach, again, another messenger is sent who messes up on a mission and says, Zil aitili, go get me. The same way that the host said, Zil aitili kamtza, bring me kamtza. Instead, Bar Kamsa shows up. Go get me flour, fine flour. By the time he got there, it was sold out because it's a siege and it's a famine. Ata amarle smita laka chivarta ika. He says, no, there's no fine flour. There's just ordinary flour. So she says, Zil aitili, go get it. He goes and it's sold out. Every time the quality of the flour goes down and this servant comes back empty-handed. And in the end even says, give me the kimcha desari, the barley flour, which is of the lowest quality. Dazil is David. So there's something comical about it because very clearly it's another servant who is sent, but it's a different kind of mistake. It's not mistaken identity, but it's the same thing. Ashrei Adam Mefached Tamid, someone who is happy, who is cautious and deliberative, but is cerebral, thinks through, just like Nero did, just like the Romans did, right? Here, though, it is this almost robotic, I can only do what I'm told, and there's no creativity. There's no thinking, wait, if there's not fine flour, I should get the regular flour. And if that's not there, but there's this sense of just inaction, lack of activity, lack of creative leadership, lack of problem solving, even at the simplest level. Then back to this Marta, this aristocratic woman, Hashalfa Misana. She took off her shoe and said, Amra, I'm going to go and see if there's anything. I can't trust my servant, the idiot. I'm going to go out and see if I can find some forage for some food myself. She takes off her shoe, which is very revealing because we're going to see shoes coming up as a theme. We've seen food, we've seen famine, we've seen banquets, we've seen servants, we've seen locusts, which relate to food and sustenance. Now we're seeing the theme of a shoe, which, by the way, I cannot not say that this is sort of ironic. I've not seen it in the scholarship, nor have I seen it in sources, but it is fascinating that Tisha B'Av in particular does have this aspect of mourning, which is also about shoes. I don't know that anyone's ever connected the shoe wearing on Tisha B'Av to the story, but it does come up twice in rather comical instances. In this case, it is almost like absurd to the point of tragedy. She takes off her shoe probably because she doesn't want to dirty it and says, let me go out and see if I can find food. And then she steps on some dung outside because she's not wearing a shoe, sticks to her foot and is overcome by disgust, which is probably an appropriate interpretation there. And then she dies. So the sort of what you see here is an individual from the aristocracy who is suffering. It also reminds us of the anonymous host, right? Who is clearly wealthy enough to feed the rabbis and feed the people, clearly wealthy enough that he even turned down Bar Kamsa's gesture of paying for it, so to spare embarrassment. And here you have someone else like that individual, but it's just the sort of the tragic comedy here. She takes off her shoe because she doesn't want to spoil her garment, but that's what causes her death because she doesn't, and she's disgusted by the dung that she's not accustomed to stepping in. Karale Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Here, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is mentioned. Just want to check one quick thing. This is not the Rabbi Yochanan before. This is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is inserted for the first time, becomes the hero of the story, and is introduced here as a comment about her, quoting a pasuk in Devarim in the Tochacha that says this is sort of coming true. And then he's the first time he's mentioned here, but in a side manner. There's a different version of the story that's in the next section. We'll just get through that quickly. That it is the fig of Rabbi Tzadok that she ate, and she became also disgusted and died. And the background story is that Rabbi Tzadok sat for fasts for 40 years to avert the destruction of Yerushalayim. But many fasts, just like the fasts we have that are not Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, are only during the day. So it sounds like when he would eat something, because he was so he was not being sustained properly, you could see something, from outside his body as he was eating it. It sounds like when he would eat at night, I presume, they would give him a fig, he would suck out the liquid and then throw the rest away. And the story is that she was the one, she found that fig when she went out and got stuck by the dung and drank and ate ate the fig and died. This other version is also very revealing because it's also about how something can be life-saving and also can be destructive. And that is that it saved the life of Rav Tzadok, but on the other hand, it also tells you something else. Rav Tzadok fasted for 40 years, but the Churban still happened. So there may be also another little indictment here that even the rabbis who know something bad's going to happen, and that's anticipated there'll be a Churban, yet it's just fasting. In contrast to the action you're about to see that's taken by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So here also the rabbis may be self-critical. Halachic hair splitting and paralysis of halachic analysis is what led to destruction. But there's also this idea that fasting itself is not sufficient. It's not saying he shouldn't have fasted, but it's saying he was aware something was going to happen. He fasted, and that didn't make a difference. Not only that, but it actually led to the death of somebody else needlessly. There's a little footnote here that Marta, when she was dying, threw out all her gold and silver and threw it in the marketplace, where, of course, her unsuccessful servant couldn't get her any food, and said, "Hi, lamai mi baile." What is all this wealth for? And the pasuk is quoted to sort of undergird that. There may be also reference here to same thing. It's the affluence, which couldn't get them anywhere. And because they were just waiting for something to happen and nothing was happening, not from the side of someone fasting, not from the side of the rabbis who couldn't get it together to act upon their convictions, this also is being, attention is being brought to pay for this right here too, that all the gold and silver did not help. Okay, last sort of section here, which is probably the most famous of the story, but also very fascinating in terms of its use of language. Abba Sikra. Also probably a play on words. Sikra is like an assassin. Abba Sikra, the father of the assassins or the chief assassin, which implies he was really the head of the Biryone, the thug faction in Yerushalayim, and it says so, Reish Biryone de Yerushalayim. Barachte de Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is very common in Chazal to associate characters as being relatives, so that he is identified here as a niece of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who again just inserted himself to the story by pronouncing a pasuk about the tragic death of Marta. Havashalach le'ta b'tzina legabai. So now you begin to see, finally, an activist. He says to his nephew, "You, head of the Bione, meet me privately." Ata Amrle, he came and he says to him, Ad emat avditu hachi. How long are you going to do this? How long is your faction, the Biryone, going to keep up this obstinance, this refusal to do something? Katlitu leila alma b'kafra. You're killing the whole city with famine. Amrle ma'yavid. What can I do? Idaminu lahu midei katoli. If I say anything to them, they'll kill me. This is also the same paralysis, and this paralysis is even more ironic because he's the head. He, as the leader of this faction, cannot persuade his followers. It's almost like the anarchy out of control. Amalei, I myself, I'm too fearful. Again, even someone with those associated with some sort of leadership, and whether it's leadership in a constructive or destructive. Clearly it's destructive because it's causing starvation and famine in the city, yet he cannot stand up to his own members as well, also a failure of leadership. Rabbi Yochanan note says, find me a solution that I can exit the city. Efshar dahave, and the most famous comment of this whole section, Hatzala Porta, maybe there'll be some small salvation, though we do not know what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has in mind. And then his nephew says, Nekot nafshech b'tzirei, leitikol yam v'shar lubach, aite midet sarya, agnuv gabach lemenach nafshach. So this is the whole famous plan. Pretend you're ill. People will expect you to die. You'll put something putrid along with your remains, your assumed remains, and your students will take you. Let no one know about this or touch you because, or carry you, because the Biyone know that a corpse does have different weight than a live person. Moving on, Abid Hachi, so they did it. So interestingly, Yochanan Zakkai says, give me a way to leave the city. But it is the Reish Biyone comes up with the idea. They do it. Rabbi Eliezer, one student on one side, Rabbi Shua on the other side, Kimata Lepitcha, when they get to the gate, Boy Lemidkre, very important. Do not mistake this for the Romans, because who was preventing the rabbis from making peace? It was the Biyone, or the internal problem. They're at the gate, and they will not let anyone go out to make peace. So they first want to check. They don't trust that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has indeed died. They want to pierce him. So it sounds like Reish Biyone, Abba Sikra says, Yomru Rabban Dekaru. They'll say that they pierced their rabbis. So they want to push him to see if he'll wake up or he's just pretending to be dead. Amrlu Yomru Rabban Dachfu. And they'll say, notice where you saw that phrase before, Yomru, Yomru. Who said Yomru, Yomru? That was Rav Zachariah ben Avkulis, who says they'll say. Always worried about what they'll say. But here's a twist on it. Here's a Yomru that's not halachic hair splitting. This is a Yomru that actually got Rabbi Yochanan through the gate. So it's also a little bit of a mocking Yomru that you said before, which led to this terrible plight of famine and disaster and starvation and siege. Now I'm using that same argument, not a rabbi, but the Reish Biyone, they'll say that they can pierce their rabbis. So the Biyone let off, and he was able to leave. And then the dramatic confrontation, which is also very revealing. When he arrives, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gets out of the city and then says, the first thing he says to Vespasian is Shalma alach malka. Where have you heard that phrase before? Not only that, the storyteller tells us that he said it twice. Shalma alach malka, peace be upon you, the king. Where did we see that? We saw it when the rabbis wanted to make peace with the Malchut, but they cowered and they were indecisive and they took no action. They did not establish leadership. And then we saw it another time, okay, in which the rabbis in the town, in the city, 3 years after famine, 3 years after siege, say, let's make peace with them. And the Biyone say no, and they just accept that. See here, the first thing that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says is Shalach Malka, Shalach, almost as if the storyteller is telling us that's what should have been done. Twice before, finally Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as the moment of tragedy is about to hit and the attack is about to take place, he finally gets it and says, peace be upon you, king, peace be upon you, king. Then there's a fascinating exchange, fascinating. So Vespasian says, you are worthy of death twicely. One is, I'm not the king, I'm not the emperor, I'm just the general. Yet you're calling me a king. That is quite exceptional. Yeah. The two, Malkana, and this is such an indictment. And if I am indeed the king, if I'm the king, why didn't you come to me until now? Now, we don't know what Vespasian meant by that. What does that mean? Why did you come to me now? But we as the readers know exactly what this is. The storyteller is saying, what is with you, rabbis? You didn't come to negotiate. You made feeble attempts at preventing this catastrophe from occurring. If I'm the king, why didn't you come? Where have you been for all these years of the siege, of the famine? Where have you been? And it's pretty clearly, because remember, we always have that word, send to someone. Why have you, lo atit legabai? Why have not you, zil aite, go and send? How come no one has come to me yet? So it turns out that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did have relatively rational responses, but you'll see how he did it. So then he responded and says, wait a second, Vespasian, Lav Malka, if you say Lav Malkana, if you say you're not the king, Ibra Malkat, you are the king or will be the king shortly. Because if you're not the king, then Yerushalayim would not be given into your hands. It'll only be given into a king's hands. And then he quotes Psukim to show that. And then he says, and regarding your other issue, Imalka Ana, if you're the king, why did it take so long for me to come? The Biryone Lo Shavkinan. Again, I, the rabbi, Rabbanan, couldn't go because the Biryone would not let us. Lo Shavkinan, same word as not let us. That was also said for Bar Kamsa, please let me stay. And he was not allowed to stay. So here it was, the same sort of thing. He's acting with some initiative. On the other hand, he's certainly not taking responsibility because he's blaming the Biryone. Now there's a fascinating little riddle, which we don't have time to enter. You can take a look at this later. I'll send the text here. Fascinating little riddle, which is that Vespasian responds to Rabbi Yochanan with a riddle. The key of the riddle is not so much the content of it, but that ishtik. See this word ishtik? Rabbi Yochanan was given a riddle, which somehow is an explanation of what Vespasianus was about to do, attacking the city, but he could not solve the riddle. So first the narrator is putting in that Rabbi Yochanan was dumbfounded. He could not. Smart man, but he was dumbfounded and could not solve the riddle. Karele Rav Yosef Yitem Rabbi Akiva, and so his fellow rabbis later on say about him, that God can sometimes bring the sages backwards and make their knowledge foolish, which means colleagues. Rav Yosef, there's also a subtle pun there. Rav Yosef is that he should have been able to add, meaning Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai should have been able to say more. He should have said, Shaklin and Tzavta, this is the solution to the riddle. We can go through the symbolism of the riddle at another time, how much this applies to the situation, but I want to get to the end of the story. This, though, is ishtik. He was silent, he could not solve the riddle. With all his wisdom, he could not solve the riddle. Other rabbis had to sort of be critical of him for that, because there would have been a simple solution to the riddle. Then, Adehachi ate pristika alei merome. Finally, the news from Rome comes, and they say, get up, Vespasian, because you are the new emperor, because the emperor has died. And they want to appoint you. Here, another comical story about a shoe. Havesiem chad misane. He happened to be, at the time that he got this fantastic news, wearing one shoe. Of course, he wants to put on the other. It wouldn't go on. He wanted to take off the first shoe. It wouldn't go off. And he says, what's going on here? And then, what does Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tell him? Lo titzdayer, don't be afraid. I know exactly. Shmua tovat yalach, you got good news. And the psukim, the Torah that say, when you get good news, your feet swells. That's why you can't take it off. But then Vespasian says, well, what do I do? So he says, fascinating. Let a person who is not a friend, but is an enemy of yours, come before you, and then your foot will stop its swelling. He was able to do it. Fascinating. What is this about? Have someone you're displeased with come before you, and then it will cease its swelling. Remind you of Bar Kamsa, right? That you, someone who you hated, you forced to leave your banquet, but here the solution to the problem for Vespasian is to have someone who is hated walk close proximity in order for him to assume his position in a dignified way. And then again, if you're so smart, again, the storyteller putting these words of indictment into the mouths of a non-Jewish Roman governor or emperor. If you're so smart, why didn't you come to me sooner? Meaning, again, if you're so smart, why didn't you come to me sooner? Your inaction just left disaster in its wake. Didn't I tell you? I also told you. In other words, what is he saying? I'm blaming it on the Biryone again. He says, well, I already told you what I thought about that. So there's this sort of a constant condemnation back and forth, but especially even for the hero of the story, there's a condemnation of waiting too long. Ashrei adam mefachid tamid, cautious, deliberate, yes. But at one point when you are seized again with that paralysis, then disaster occurs. Now, end of the story. Amar le mezal azilna. Vespasian says, I've got to go. Finish Achrinim Shadarna, I'm going to have to send some other general. Ella, and this is fascinating. Bai minai midei da'atan lach. Tell me what it is that you wanted that I'll give to you. Which is, again, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't seize the moment. I have your attention. I solved your shoe problem. Now let me tell you what I want. It had to be coaxed out of him by Vespasian. You must have come for some reason. I already told you you should have come to me years ago. Tell me what you want. This is the most famous pronunciation, announcement of the whole story. This is the famous Tein li Yavne v'chachamea. Give me Yavne and its sages. Spare them. And then he also mentions, less famously, Shulshilta Rabbi Gamliel, the dynasty of Gamliel, to preserve sages, I guess, in that family. Yes, Fatim and Sailei, Rabbi Tzadok, and a doctor who can hear Rabbi Tzadok because he's suffering still from his 40 years of fasting. And again, other rabbis have to quote the pasuk, the same rabbis, Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Akiva. Same thing. God can turn the mind of the rabbis backwards, and their knowledge is foolish. He should have said, Lishavkinu chadazimna. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai should have said to Vespasian, let them alone this one time. In other words, even after he takes initiative, even after he acts, and even though he solves he doesn't solve the significant riddle in which the stakes of Yerushalayim are based on. Instead, he solves a minor riddle, a minor problem of shoes. So it's also making fun. The shoe is sort of the comical element of it. It also shows the contrast between I can't solve a riddle with my wisdom that affects the future destiny of my people, but I can solve a little riddle which will enable you to seek the destiny of your people, Vespasian, because you now can put on your shoes and show up in Rome to claim your position. Again, Rav Yosef and Rav Akiva making fun or mocking Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. Same language. The Shavkinu Hadazimna, Hadazimna, he should have said, leave the Jews alone this one time. He should have been able to capitalize upon his credit and made a decision to only ask for Porta, for Hatzala Porta, a small thing. And again, the Husavar, the narrator backs him up a little bit. Dilma Kulehai Lo Avid, Hatzala Porta Nami Lo Havi. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan was afraid Vespasian would not do that much for him and instead asked for something that was just a shadow of saving the city, but at least some way to continue the continuity of the Jewish people with the Torah stages. There's a footnote here to solving the problem of Rabbi Tzadok, which we also don't need to go into. Okay, so I have exceeded my time. I just want to sort of do a little bit of a sort of review of some of the major themes. Let me sort of take this off so I can see everyone. Okay, so we have seen literary references. We have seen disparate stories from different places in Shas and Midrashim that have all been coalesced together in this beautiful redaction of a story that does have echoes of itself. It is sort of nuanced, it's subtle, but the messages are pretty clear. Ashrei Adam Mefached Tamid, yes, happy is the man, praiseworthy is the person who is always cautious, fearful, deliberative, but that person who hardens his or her heart in a leadership position will yipol la'ra'ah. Maksheh libo yipol ra'ah will result in disaster of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Then there's this cascade of consequences, much of it dealing with food and starvation and famine and war. Some of the comical aspects of the locusts that come in through Kamsa, some of the references to the servant who doesn't complete a mission. So there's also that theme of not being creative. So it seems to Dr. Rubenstein, and I've just been taken by the theme, that this is a very revealing portrait of where the rabbis are held responsible for the destruction. It's not to say they should not have engaged in political leadership. It almost sounds like the storyteller saying, you have the opportunity, seize it. But every time there's an opportunity, and every time there's even a slight gesture, movement towards salvation, and they understand the value, they know Churban will happen, they know they can do things to stop it, they know the value of Shalom Malchut, yet in each and every turn they fail. And even when Rabbi Yochanan does take that action and says, I need a solution, uses his relative to help him come up with the takana, even there's this ultimate indictment of not a complete Hatzalah. He may have had a justification. On the other hand, he could have asked for more. No one really knows what the answer to that dilemma is, but it's pretty clear that dilemma after dilemma, there's a pitting of indecision, inaction, paralysis versus taking leadership, and also knowing that when someone takes on the leadership mantle, you cannot be fully confident. And I think that's the message at the end. Leadership is required. And it needs to be for social justice, and it needs to be to save the Jewish community. And you can't just sit there and do nothing. On the other hand, you also need to know when you do take actions as an inspired leader, not always are you assured that you have asked or acted properly, and some consequences are going to be beyond your control, but that's never an excuse. It was almost like all the people who failed along the way were paralyzed by an action because they were worried about what would happen. But leadership requires certain risk, certain calculation, and it's never going to assure salvation. And one has to know that because there are circumstances beyond our control, but at least one has to consider them and act upon it carefully, cautiously, but always to act. Thank you for your attention. And this Tisha B'Av, may this Tisha B'Av inspire us all to see circumstances similar to it, take the necessary action, understand what those risks are, but to be committed to the salvation and the future of the Jewish people as well as all humanity, especially under the circumstances that we're undergoing now, which clearly, without being too sermonic or homiletic about it, to have some echoes, certainly, of some of the story. May everyone have a meaningful fast and a healthy and safe remainder to the summer. And thank you for your attention and thank you for listening.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Stochel. Thank you for this beautiful, beautiful class. And I think we all are inspired by it and have a lot to think about. Just wanted to make sure that everybody remembers that at 3:30 today, we will continue our series, our Tisha B'Av series. Rabbi Kenny Shiowitz, the Talmud Department Chair at Ramaz, and a well-known scholar in his own right, and Rabbi Imtinak, will be delivering a shiur on taking the message of Tisha B'Av home. Please join us at 3:30 back with using the same link. And then we will end our day at 5:30 with a class by Dr. John Jacoby, the chair of our history department at the upper school. And it is From Tragedy to Nation, a historical view. And I think we have a lot to grow from and learn from. And thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Have a meaningful and easy fast.